There is no self in the brain, and in this video, we'll not only explore that, but we'll explore how different versions of the self are either undesirable or, in some cases, actually frightening. And so before we get there, check out the description section where I put a link to an upcoming 3-month intensive, customizable workshop led by Lisa McCourt, who is this amazing guide who is going to help get your vibrational consciousness up to its true natural state, which is joy. And I'll be helping out a little bit. I'll be contributing 3 90-minute lectures, but they're not lectures. Don't even think of it like that. They're interactive places where we're on live and we could do exercises and, go back and forth with questions and just really see if we can eliminate all the illusion, get down to who we actually are, which is actually kind of what this video is about. And so what is the self? And so the self, we can use words like personhood, and this doesn't get us very far. We could talk about qualities of the self, like memories, and we'll talk about memories, decision making. And so the self feels like some little pilot, behind the eyes, between the ears, running the show, calling the shots, making the decisions, and in some ways we think of ourselves as the, end result of all the decisions that this little pilot has made in terms of our entire lives. We could also be our preferences. And so we are what we like and dislike. And so I have a preference for a certain type of guitar, Kiesel guitars, and you're like, I've never heard of those. Well, because you may not care at all about guitars, and that gives us a certain uniqueness. So the self is defined by its unique preferences, what makes it an individual as opposed to just a conformist in the group. So if we were all the same, there would be no selfhood. So selfhood seems to be related to our individual uniqueness. And this uniqueness sometimes is thought of as, again, like a little person running the show, making the decisions, which makes us unique. And in some cases, humans have looked at this as a homunculus, literally like a little person inside the skull. And we do buy this to some extent because there's a plethora, 30, 40 movies maybe. I've never actually counted them, but they are all based on this premise that this little self, this pilot, homunculus, can switch bodies with someone else. And it's always a comedy because it would be so weird to, wake up in another meat suit. But that suggests that there is some kind of little self in the brain that's making this travel across bodies. And so just the fact that we have those movies suggests that we buy into that to some extent. For Daniel Dennett, the famous philosopher, the self was the center of the center of narrative gravitation. And so what he meant by that is the self is the self behind all the stories of the self. In other words, the self is the kind of hub of the story wheel. And so it's the center of all the stories we tell in our lives, but focusing mostly on it's a story, so it's not something physical. And so that's where it gets kind of interesting, and this is what we'll cover because let's take a look at memories. And so I have memories of childhood. And that gives me the impression that there's some kind of continuity. So if I look at my 10-year-old self, it feels like there's some kind of continuity, that 10-year-old self is the same self that I'm sitting here at 57. Now, the problem with that is that we also know that every single thing has changed. So not only is all the preferences, all the decisions I would make as a 10-year-old are completely different as a 57-year-old, literally everything we can go down the list, they're all completely different. Even the physical meat suit, in terms of going down to the very particles that make it up, all those have been replaced in that time. The cells have been replaced. So in that sense, there's nothing that's similar, but it feels like something was continuous. And that will bring up this notion of a soul. And so we may ask, does the soul have any sense of changing? And so in a way, we can get to this with an exercise. And I did this in the Neurotics Guide, where you question and ponder what is worthy of eternity. So what part of your selfhood is worth an afterlife? And you don't have to buy into an afterlife to do the exercise. And what you see with this, when you ponder it for a while, like, what do you really want to make it to eternity? Because a lot of the ego-based aspects of the self disappear. And so age, race, and do I want to be a male for eternity in spite of, Monty Python's funny song in Meaning of Life? That's not something that would be desirable. In fact, I wouldn't even want my name to go through eternity. Chris, billions of years. And again, if we add that with memory, so, maybe I'll make it 80 or 90 years or something on this planet. And then for the rest of eternity, would I want to have the identity that I had for that very, very short time? And so play with that exercise, and it'll come up with some, I think, interesting things. What if we wipe away memory altogether? And so look at the case of HM. HM had his medial temporal lobes removed and couldn't form a new memory since he was, I think it was 27. So, and he lived until his 80s. And so, what self lived that last 60 years? And it's interesting because he absolutely had preferences. He couldn't remember them, but they were still there. So there was a dance at the institution that he was at, and every year he really enjoyed the dance, even though he had no memory of ever attending. And so that's where we go with this. So the self is a strange collection of memories, a history, preferences, a story. But at the same time, all of these can change, and none of one is absolutely necessary. So you can play with this and ask, well, what is left? And whatever it is, let's get to the point of the video. So what I'm saying, look, we don't have the self absolutely defined. If someone asks, who are you? The best answer may be something along the lines of, I don't know. A work in progress. Maybe it'll be discovered someday. But the truth is, it's hard to pinpoint exactly who we are. But whatever we are, let's get to the point of, can we find that in the brain? And so when we open the brain, what do we find? And you don't have to be a neurosurgeon for this. You can watch videos and you can see brain surgery. And what you find, and you can see models. I had a model of the brain somewhere. What you'll find is this 3 pounds of gelatinous goo. It's about the consistency of half-done Jell-O. 87 billion neurons, which are the processing cells, a whole lot of supporting cells. You'll find neurotransmitters, and all these cells are very complicatedly interconnected. In fact, one person even estimated that the number of possible connections between all these cells is greater than the particles in the known universe. And so we've got a lot of different ways to interconnect all these 87 billion processing cells. But that's all you ever, and neurotransmitters that deliver the messages from one cell to the other. So that's all you find. Now that's an important point because no matter how deep you go, that's all you're ever going to find you'll never find a memory. You'll never find a preference. You'll never find any of the qualities that seem to make a self. You'll only find these qualities of the brain. So take something like pain. There's no place in the brain where you're going to find pain. But again, in the same quest for selfhood, these neuroscientists, they'll make the claim, they'll say, well, and this is a whole area of research. Well, they'll say, look, we're going to have this person, they're going to think about themselves and look to see which areas of the brain light up. And so that's an entire area of research. And of course, that's what neuroscience does. So maybe some areas do light up. And it's a very complex, inconsistent set of research. But let's imagine something like the default mode, or maybe the left brain, or some area of the brain lights up. Well, this is also true for many other things. And so there's a part of the brain that lights up when we look at faces. And that gets into this notion in neuroscience that the brain is a neurological representational machine. In other words, it's creating, through all these interconnections, it's creating a map of the territory, and the territory is reality. So when I look at a face, there's some place that represents faces, and that lights up, which is to say, becomes more active. And let's imagine that's also true for the self. Let's imagine there are some cells, some neural networks in the brain that every time we consider who we are, these cells light up. So is that who we are? See where I was going with this? Like, do you really want to have your identity as a set of cells that lights up when you think about who you are? So if someone says, well, who are you? The answer is, well, I'm a set of cells dedicated to the idea of who I think I am. And that last part is important because when the cells that light up for faces become, they're active, well, there's a face out there in reality. The problem with the self is these cells are lighting up to something that doesn't even exist in the real world, and I can prove that to you right now. In the same way that you can look in the mirror and see a face, find the self. Look at the self. In any way, sense that there is a self in the world. So no matter how much you ponder your experiences and wander through the mountains, it's like a Zen riddle. I mean, what is your face before you were born? Take a look to see who you are, and you will never be able to see yourself. And so what it comes down to is two different options. One, you can think of yourself as a set of cells that represents a self which doesn't even exist in reality. In other words, it's just a thought. That's not terribly appealing. The other version is maybe there is some homunculus. Maybe we haven't found it yet, but maybe there is some little self somewhere in the brain. And that option is quite terrifying because it would be almost like some little parasite. And if there is that little parasite, that self that's behind the eyes, between the ears, if that self is there, again, not only is it quite scary, but it's also not going to work because people have pointed this out. That little parasitic self would also have to have an even smaller little parasitic self in its brain. And so when it comes down to both of those options, there's nothing self-like that we can stick somewhere in the brain. And if there were, we certainly haven't found it yet. So this brings us to that third option of a soul. Now, psychology doesn't want to talk about that, although they have taken the subject back up. Because the option of a soul gives us an expression of uniqueness, and it also gives us a sense of non-duality and interconnectedness in the same way that the ocean can have an infinite number of unique waves and still be one. We could still have some expression of uniqueness, and it wouldn't have to be tied to the brain because, of course, the soul is a non-physical entity. Well, guess what? Maybe consciousness is also non-physical. And the problem with trying to work all this out of how does a non-physical concept like the soul or consciousness, how does it interact with the physical world, that may itself simply be a thinking problem.